What's going on, guys? It's Simo, and today I'm bringing to you an updated meta-analysis for the April 2018 format. Now, we haven't done a meta-analysis in quite some time, and the reason for that is mainly because nothing has actually been going on. We just had the conclusion of YCS Memphis this past weekend, and the weekend prior to that was the ARG that took place in San Jose. So, I figured now would be an opportune moment to bring you guys an updated meta-analysis, show you guys where things are at, and pretty much provide you any insight into any new developments into the format. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always, and we haven't shouted out patrons since I got my wisdom teeth taken out, so there's a lot of them. So big shout outs today to Noah, to Michael, Adam, Pierre, Leonard, Trent, YGO Insider, Yugi Brony, Tom, and Relson. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong, and if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So here is the pie chart of the top 32 breakdown from YCS Memphis, and when you look at this pie chart, you're going to start noticing that we've kind of gotten to a very static part of the format where things are starting to look a little bit redundant. You know, Pendulum Magician's on top, Draco's in second, blah 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 blah. However, once we hit this point in the format, pretty much one of two things is effectively going to change where we're at. We either need a brand new product introduced into the game to inject a whole slew of new cards that are basically going to warp the meta in a significant way, or we just need a ban list. Now, Flames of Destruction is coming out a couple weeks from the time that I'm recording this video, but Flames of Destruction isn't going to have a major impact on the metagame. Now, individual cards from Flames of Destruction will impact the format, but there isn't like a Zodiac archetype like Raging Tempest or a true Draco archetype like Maximum Crisis that's really going to enter the game and change things drastically enough that it's going to pretty much warrant having the entire format shift and pretty much be solved all over again. At this point, I'd say the format's essentially been solved, and the only thing that's really going to fix it at this point is getting a new ban list. But more on that a little bit later. I want to talk about these decks and pretty much some new insights and developments for these decks because there actually is a lot to discuss in terms of that. So I want to start off with Pendulum Magician. I'm not going to touch on Pendulum Magician too much because Pendulum Magician has essentially already been figured out. We've known this has been the best deck for quite some time now, but there is some information I do have that hasn't exactly been discussed, and that is in terms of the FTK. Now, previously, what I found interesting is that Konami actually used to provide and disclose the information from Top Cut YCS breakdowns of how many players were playing the Pendulum FTK compared to how many that weren't. And I thought that was really cool because by separating it, we actually got to see which of the two builds had more representation. Now, obviously, Pendulum Magician is still Pendulum Magician, but it really goes to show how much more prevalent one build is over the other, and really if one build in terms of like the FTK, for instance, is actually plaguing the format. And I find it fascinating that they actually didn't break it down like that for this particular event, and I think I know the reason why. If you think about it, let's say hypothetically that all 12 of the top 32, all 12 of the Pendulum Magician decks that made top 32, let's say they were all the Pendulum Magician FTK. It doesn't exactly look good for them as a company when other people are looking up Top Cut results from these tournaments, and you look and see that the deck that pretty much has 33% of the Top Cut representation is being dominated by a singular FTK deck. That doesn't exactly just bode well for them, so I think it was actually an intentional decision to not disclose which decks were the Pendulum FTK compared to regular Pendulum Magician because the optics didn't look good from, you know, a player perspective, because then the player base might get discouraged and say, oh look, a Pendulum FTK, like it's just gonna be the best deck and everyone's gonna be playing Pend FTK. I think that was intentional, but lucky for you guys, you have me, and I actually did the digging for you, and I was able to find 10 of the 12 Pendulum Magician deck profiles, and I can tell you that half of them were Pendulum FTK, and the other half were not. Now, I'm missing 2 of those profiles, and honestly, it's not statistically significant to add those 2 because it's either going to be 6 and 6 or 7 and 5 with those included, and that's not really statistically significant enough to make a difference in either deck's favor. However, the fact that half of the Pendulum Magician decks were FTKs, at least in my eyes, tells me there's a problem, because that means that 25% of the decks that topped YCS Memphis effectively were playing some sort of FTK. And I talked about this time and time again, I really just don't think that's healthy for the game. Not the fact that there's just one FTK deck, but the fact that there's multiple FTK decks, but we're going to be getting into that a little bit later. So, Pendulum Magician still on top. I think since we need a ban list, I definitely think that Pendulum Magician FTK should be and better be addressed, because I think now that the format's solved, players are only just going to pick up the FTK more and more. It's only going to become more pervasive, and I feel it's definitely just going to become more degenerate as time goes on without a ban list. Now, touching on True Draco is still the best counter deck to Pendulum Magician. You've got stuff like your Floodgates, like Anti-Spell Fragrance, that can basically just blow them out as soon as the game starts. And then you've got all the Draw Power Masterpiece. You guys know all of this already. One interesting thing about Draco, though, is that the fact that even though it's made the 25% of the top cut representation, Flames of Destruction is actually going to make a significant impact on Draco's viability. And that's because of one card, Red Reboot. Now, Red Reboot is going to allow players to effectively shut down every single trap card that True Draco players use, such as Anti-Spell Fragrance, such as True King's Return, basically any of the trap cards that are very annoying to deal with going against Draco going second. Red Reboot is much more effective at dealing with these threats than, say, something like Twin Twister, because not only can they not chain the cards because Red Reboot is a counter trap card, but they're going to be shut down from using any and all trap cards for the duration of that turn. And that's a really big deal, especially depending on if you're playing decks like Pendulum, who have the ability to OTK just straight through a board. So the fact that one card is going to be able to change that entire dynamic, I definitely think True Draco might be in a bit of trouble once Flames of Destruction is released. Now, True Draco is still going to be incredibly strong, but I definitely think that this card, especially being in the super rare slot, is going to be a very good side option moving into the Flames of Destruction format. Now, this moves us on to Trickstar. Now, this took me by surprise because from YCS Salt Lake City, only one Trickstar deck made the top 32, so I thought Trickstar was on the decline, but lo and behold, Trickstar managed to take 4 of the top 32 slots at YCS Memphis. Now, you guys remember how I said that because I felt Draco had a really good matchup against Trickstar, Trickstar was going to fall out of favor. But I also said that with that, Trickstar is also one of the best decks for adapting to any particular solved format, because since the engine is so condensed, it can play such a wide variety of different tech cards and choices that can really optimize the deck for a particular format. It's so open-ended, and that's what we've started to see. A majority of the Trickstar players at this event were maining 3 copies of Torrential Tribute. Now, this is really good for Trickstar because Trickstar thrives on a simplified game state. Torrential Tribute effectively allows the Trickstar player to just wipe the board clean and start fresh, and that's where Trickstar is going to be able to thrive, because not only are you going to be able to establish your normal summons like Candina and Licorice, but then you also have your Scapegoat plays, which can just snowball out of control, and that's where Trickstar is going to be able to take the game away in complete control. So I like seeing the new developments of this, and be wary now because Trickstar players are going to be playing Torrential Tribute, so it's definitely something you're going to want to keep your eye on. Other than that, though, we still had the just majority of different decks that were taking up the last quarter of the top 32 breakdown. There was 2 60-card dinosaur decks. 60-card Dino's kind of been hanging in there as one of those other choices that's managed to make a couple of top cut slots. We also had 3 Metal Foes Draco, which is starting to see a bit of an uptick in popularity as well. I think that's a really cool deck. It kind of takes the elements of Pendulum Magician and Draco and fuses it into one deck, and I think that's really neat. But then we also had a Zombie Plant. We had only 1 Mech Knight invoked, which previously had 4 top cut slots at YCS Seattle, and what I think is fascinating about this is Mech Knight Invoked to me seemed like a better Trickstar, because Mech Knight Invoked is a better deck for going second, so you could optimize playing not only against True Draco, but also Pendulum Magician, both non-FTK and FTK variants. So Mech Knight Invoked to me seemed like the better choice, but now we see kind of almost the reverse, where Trickstar is now the better deck compared to Mech Knight Invoked. relative to the results of YCS Salt Lake City. So I found that really fascinating, but maybe players realize that, you know, if they make the Mech Knight Invoke player go first, they're at a severe disadvantage in games 2 and 3, and maybe ultimately that was what the demise was for Mech Knight Invoked. Last but not least, so there was one Gem Knight FTK player that managed to make the top 32 as well. Interestingly enough, Gem Knight FTK also won the ARG that took place in San Jose. So this is definitely another deck you need to have on your radar, because Gem Knight FTK's basically been able to sneak in one top cut for the last few events, and that's something you definitely need to be aware of. This is really interesting because even though it's an FTK deck, it's playing a bunch of other cards that basically aren't as good as you might think compared to something like Pendulum Magician, but it's still been able to just power through because it can play through so many different hand traps because the deck is solely focused on trying to achieve that FTK. And the deck that topped YCS Memphis was a 60 card variant, if you can believe that. So I'd highly recommend checking out that profile because it's definitely one of the more interesting ones from YCS Memphis. The last thing I did want to touch on is the fact that with Lair of Darkness's release right before YCS Memphis, not a single Lair of Darkness deck, that includes Infernoid variants or anything like that, managed to make the top 32 cut. I believe there was one that managed to make day 2, but was just shy of making that top 32, and I think that's really interesting because this is a deck that a lot of people were kind of hyping because Lair of Darkness is an extremely powerful card, Darkus Diabolos, Lilith, things like that, especially in tandem with Infernoids, but realistically, I don't think this is the format for that deck, but there might be an opportunity if we get a ban list for a deck like this to thrive in the future. Ultimately, I definitely think it's time for a ban list. I think that'll really shake things up, especially with Flames of Destruction right around the corner. I think people have essentially solved the format, and there's not really going to be anything too earth-shattering going forward, so by having a new ban list, we're going to start to see, you know, a nice new little refreshing format, and not that this format's bad, but I think it's definitely time to put things like Pendulum Magician and Draco in check and kind of see what can become of doing so. So guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this meta analysis. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.